One fine morning, Americans were sipping coffee, Canadians were pouring maple syrup over pancakes, and then no one flew anymore. Not because of a snowstorm, not because of a system failure, but because an entire nation said, "We're done playing, neighbor." Yes, you read that right. In 2025, Canada announced a boycott of all non-essential flights to the United States. A decision that sounded like a joke, but triggered a domino effect that shook the tourism, political, and consumer sectors on both sides of the border. And the big question is, what made two best friends for centuries suddenly unfriend each other in the skies? Let's start with a blow that didn't land at the airport, but in the wallet. A blow to the wallet. No need for rockets, warships, or spies. In 2025, U.S.-Canada tensions began with something much simpler: steel, aluminum, and a massive tariff bill. Washington struck first, Ottawa struck back. But instead of gunfire, people heard the cold ping of credit cards that no longer swiped. And just like that, a crisis between North America's closest allies, officially, took off without an airplane. To understand this spark, we have to go back to a long-standing specialty of American politics: tariffs, a cocktail that's equal parts strategic flavor and bitter for friends. In early 2025, the U.S. government decided to impose a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imported from Canada. The reason? National security. The response from the North? A politely raised eyebrow, very Canadian, followed by a wave of outrage stretching from Parliament to coffee shops. In less than 10 days, Ottawa announced its counterpunch: a suspension of all non-essential flights to the U.S., an act akin to locking the barn. Only this time, it's the hangar. What's worth noting is that this wasn't the first collision. Trade relations between the two countries had been bumpy for several years. From softwood lumber, dairy, to oil pipelines, nearly everything had been tossed onto the negotiating table with less than gentle tone. But unlike past spats, usually ending with a few awkward handshakes and a joint press conference, this time Canada wasn't interested in talking anymore. They acted, and they acted big. Some Americans chuckled at first. "Oh, it's just Canada. Those nice folks don't stay mad for long." But when they looked at flight maps and saw entire routes from Toronto to Orlando canceled, the laughter quickly turned into serious questions inside White House briefings. Why did steel and aluminum become the last straw? Because they're not just metals. They're symbols of supply chains, mutual exchange, and two-way trust. When the U.S. rolled out a domestic protection tariff, Canada saw it as the equivalent of being kicked in the shins halfway through a soccer game they'd been playing on the same team. And no one likes getting stomped on by their own teammate. In reality, the Canadian public reacted faster than the government. Hashtags like "Nosh Bye Bye Florida" and "No Fly USA" flooded social media. Families who had booked Disney tours instantly rerouted to Mexico, Europe, or within Canada. People who once proudly posted photos of camping in Yellowstone now opted for beer in Banff. This was no longer a top-down political decision. It was a bottom-up movement, a rebellion carried out with luggage. Ironically, amid the rising diplomatic tension, many Americans responded in a very American way: practical, humorous, and curious. A resident in Arizona said on local TV, "If they're not coming anymore, I guess I'd better learn to make poutine to keep the guests." A hotel owner in Florida put up a sign: "Dear Canadians, we don't tax smiles here." But behind the cheerfulness was a quiet worry. Is this the start of an economic separation? If steel and aluminum were the excuse, then what's next? Tech? Agriculture? Values? When people start questioning the foundation of a relationship, everything, from handshakes to airfare, becomes fragile. And that's what made this blow to the wallet a historic strike. It wasn't merely economic retaliation, it was a cold but clear declaration. We may be neighbors, but that doesn't mean we have to keep enduring this. There were no planes in the sky, but the confrontation had just taken off, when the neighbor no longer drops by on weekends. If the tariff blow was the first slap, then the slow slide at airports and border crossings was the clearest sign. The close relationship between the U.S. and Canada was going through its coldest season yet, and this time it wasn't because of snow. In March 2025, a strange silence began to spread across border region airports. No more announcements like, "Now boarding to Miami." No more Canadian travelers rushing to exchange coins at Buffalo Airport ATMs. Airports became as quiet as a library in Alberta, and that's not a metaphor. But the shock didn't happen overnight. It started gradually, like the sound of ice melting in a cup of maple syrup. Very subtle, but everyone could feel it. First, a few flight cancellations due to technical reasons. Then airlines began cutting regular routes, and then, while everyone was still waiting to see if it was just a typical winter disruption, Canada quietly closed its skies. Car rental companies in Buffalo, once a familiar transit hub for Canadians coming to shop in the U.S., began noticing something odd. Cars were no longer booked on weekends. Hotel staff in Michigan wondered why those Ontario license plate drivers hadn't checked in as usual. Stores in Vermont asked each other why no one was buying discounted winter coats this year. And when you piece together all these signs, you get a clear picture. One of the biggest channels of trade and cultural exchange in North America was freezing over. Imagine this. A family in Toronto used to take their kids to Disney in Florida every year. The routine was as ingrained as their morning coffee. But now, instead of packing their suitcases, they're Googling Cuba tours or booking a cabin in Nova Scotia. A retired uncle in Saskatchewan, who used to migrate for winter regularly to Arizona to escape the frost, now sits in his recliner watching snow fall outside the window, considering curling instead of golf. The issue isn't the canceled trip. The issue lies in the feeling of losing a routine, losing a part of the cross-border everyday life that Canadians once saw as a given. A vacation isn't just travel, it's an emotional connection. And when millions of those connections are suddenly cut off, the atmosphere along the border becomes silent. Literally. On the U.S. side, there was a bit of confusion, mixed with disappointment. "We thought they'd be mad for a while and then come back," said a border agent in North Dakota, "but now I've got time to learn French during my shift." Small towns that once thrived on Canadian visitors also began to feel the weight of what could be called an unannounced economic void. Not loud, not violent, but clear and persistent. However, true to the optimistic spirit of both nations, there was still humor in the disruption. An RV rental agency in Seattle posted a sign, "We're holding your ride until the politics chill out." A bar in Niagara Falls named its new cocktail Maple Meltdown, with Canadian maple syrup, a splash of American tequila, and one very sour lemon wedge. But don't let the laughter mask reality. Numbers don't joke. In just the first 3 months of the year, the number of Canadian travelers to the U.S. dropped by over 70%. Buses from Vancouver to Seattle, once packed with weekend shoppers, now run empty. Border region shopping malls, once beloved rendezvous points, started shortening their hours because there's no reason to turn the lights on early anymore. Instead of reacting too harshly, Americans, true to form, switched to strategizing. Can we attract more Mexican tourists instead? Should we launch a new campaign? Florida, welcoming every smile, regardless of passport. Meanwhile, Canada remained polite, as always. Only this time, they chose silence through action. This decline isn't just a tourism statistic. It's a crack in the structure of habit and trust. A shift not born of hostility, but of disappointment. When a neighbor no longer stops by on weekends, sometimes it's not because they hate you, but because they no longer feel welcome like before. And perhaps the most sobering thought is, if travel was once the bridge, then its absence might also be the goodbye. The shock on both sides of the border. When flights stopped and suitcases no longer rolled south, it wasn't just the United States that felt empty. Canada also began to feel the true cost of a decision that once seemed merely symbolic. Because behind patriotic slogans and angry hashtags lies a truth everyone must face. The economy is not a lover who forgets easily. Canadian airports, once as bustling as shopping malls on Boxing Day, now quieted to the point where you could hear the solitary roll of a suitcase gliding across the floor. At Toronto Pearson, the departure boards for international flights slowly lost familiar names like Tampa, Phoenix, Las Vegas. Routes once as reliable as a Swiss watch were now trimmed down like a low-carb diet menu. The first to feel this chill wasn't the government, but the airlines. With names like Air Canada, WestJet, Flair, or Porter, once proud bridges between snowy winters and golden U.S. sunshine, they began to see every empty seat as a heavy financial loss. According to internal reports, in just the first quarter of 2025, passenger numbers on Canada-U.S. routes dropped by over 41%. The planes were still there, pilots still ready, only the passengers had vanished. Worse still, local airports, which survived on short U.S. routes, began to panic. Saskatoon, Halifax, Regina once needed just a few flights a day to keep the cash flow stable. But when no one flew to Seattle, no one weekend trip to Chicago, the balance sheets suddenly turned red like autumn leaves. And travel agencies? If in 2024 they had to hire extra staff during winter to handle the flood of U.S. tour bookings, then in 2025 it became a season of unanswered calls. One agent in Vancouver shared, "In my 30 years in this business, I've never heard an office so quiet. I could even hear the coffee machine sighing." With a 75% drop in U.S. tour bookings, they had to cut half their staff, shifting from tour sales to staycation consulting in Banff. But the shock wasn't just in canceled trips. It was in disrupted long-term dreams. Since the 1980s, hundreds of thousands of Canadians carried a very specific ideal in their hearts: escaping the cold through a vacation home in Florida or Arizona. These snowbirds, winter migrants, created a silent cultural rhythm between the two countries. Canada provided the people, America the sunshine. Every year, millions of dollars poured into real estate, golf, medicine, food, gas, all part of a seamless economic dance. But this year, the music stopped. Real estate listings in Miami or Scottsdale began to show a new wave. Canadian owner must sell fast. A Toronto-based financial firm reported that requests to liquidate U.S. vacation homes rose 300% in just 2 months. Not because prices dropped, but because the dream no longer came with a passport. A retiree in Montreal shared, "I used to dream of reading on the porch in Sarasota, playing early morning golf, and shopping at farmers markets on weekends. Now I'm online searching whether I can garden year-round in Victoria." And then there's the part no one says out loud, but everyone thinks: when a Canadian sells a home in the U.S., they're not just selling bricks and mortar. They're selling an idea. The idea that America is the place to go when winter knocks. From there, ripple effects spread. Budgets for maintaining U.S. properties vanished. Local gas stations lost loyal customers. Pharmacies, grocery stores, family diners lost familiar revenue. A stream of money once quiet and steady now drained away with each vehicle that no longer returned. Still, not everyone was sad. In Quebec, travel agencies began marketing vacations at home with slogans like, "Who needs Florida when you have Gaspé?" In Halifax, pubs proudly hung signs, "Spend your money here, it's warmer than you think." And the strange thing is, in the midst of crisis, Canadians rediscovered themselves. They learned to enjoy places once forgotten for southern sun. They began investing in domestic travel. Airlines revisited cross-country route plans. A loss, unintentional, became an opportunity to redefine happiness closer to home. So, even though the market is reeling and a quiet sadness lingers, the North American spirit of optimism hasn't disappeared. And who knows? Among all the closed doors, people may find a new one. Not flying farther, but flying deeper. Florida without maple leaves. If you've ever set foot in Florida during the winter, you're probably familiar with the image of a Canadian gentleman wearing a sun hat, driving a convertible to buy fish sauce. But by 2025, that image suddenly vanished as if someone had erased a whole layer from the picture of southern U.S. tourism. And what surprised people the most? Canadians stopped coming, and they didn't seem to regret it much. At resorts around Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, or Clearwater, front desk staff began getting used to saying "hablas español" instead of "bonjour." The absence of Team Maple Leaf wasn't just a linguistic gap, it was a financial shock. According to 2024 statistics, Florida alone welcomed over 3 million Canadian visitors annually, with average spending higher than most other international tourist groups. They didn't just come to take photos with Mickey Mouse, they stayed longer, rented homes, played golf, dined out, and bought packs of paper towels at Costco like they were moving in. But by spring 2025, all of that suddenly broke off. A car rental agent in Orlando shared, half joking, half serious, "I've never missed Quebec French this much. These were easygoing guests who always returned the car with a full tank and usually left a bag of maple cookies as a parting gift. Now I just have short-term rentals and silence." And what happened in Florida was by no means an exception. Las Vegas, once a favorite getaway for groups of young Canadians seeking a taste of American grit on the weekend, now skipped a heartbeat. Hotel rooms once booked months in advance for bachelor parties or spring break now sat empty, like a dance floor at 7 p.m. Casino operators began reducing morning table counts. American-style buffet restaurants cut back on lobster portions because our regulars have switched to eating seafood from British Columbia. Of course, America is not lacking in tourists. But what makes this drop worrying is, Canadians weren't just guests. They were loyal guests. They came regularly, multiple times a year, and often stayed longer than average. A family from Ontario might visit Florida 3 times a year, for winter break, Easter, and summer. They didn't just drop by, they became part of the local economy. And when that part disappeared, businesses realized that losing a loyal guest hurts more than never gaining a new one. In California, the situation wasn't much better. From San Diego to Napa Valley, travel companies specializing in Canadian clients had to cancel tours or merge with competitors. In New York, tour guides once dedicated to Quebecois groups in French pivoted to making TikToks about Manhattan architecture to earn a living. And in Arizona, a retirement haven for older Canadians, the vacation property market began to tremble slightly, with transaction volume dropping and short-term rental prices falling 12% in just 1 quarter. Still, in true American fashion, no one stood still. In Las Vegas, a casino launched the Maple Leaf membership card, discounts for any tourist from any country with a maple leaf on their flag. In Florida, a water park rolled out a Warm Up the Neighborhood program, offering free tickets to residents from northern border towns, as long as they promise to come back at least twice once the crisis ends. Of course, behind those smiling marketing efforts lies a deeper worry. If this disruption drags on, will Canadians forget America altogether? A new generation growing up, having never been to New York, never camped in Montana, never driven the Pacific Coast Highway. Where will they feel more connected to? Paris, Lisbon, or maybe just Calgary? A tourism expert in Chicago sighed, "We're not just losing money, we're losing shared memories." And that's why this travel slide can't be taken lightly. It doesn't just lighten wallets, it may fade something far more intangible: habits, memories, and emotions. Because once the maple leaf has flown back north without looking back, Florida's sunshine, no matter how beautiful, may no longer be enough to hold them. When a handshake turns into a fist. If the empty suitcases at airports were the first sign, then the cold stares between politicians were the clearest proof. The US and Canada were no longer speaking the language of neighbors. And perhaps for the first time in decades, two countries once described as two halves of the same North American story were now looking at each other as if to say, "I think we need a little time apart." It all started with what seemed like a routine press conference in Ottawa. But a single sentence from a Canadian minister was enough to change the mood in Washington. "We no longer see this as a trade dispute," he said. "This is a matter of respect." Short, no table-pounding or finger-pointing, but sharp like a dagger drawn mid-buffet. From there, everything went downhill in a straight line. The annual Canada-US Bilateral Summit, usually held in picturesque cities, from Banff to Boston, was abruptly cancelled without even an apology. Diplomatic teams on both sides began politely declining to meet. Office assistants stopped booking flights and started canceling hotel reservations. Some sources even said a cross-border environmental cooperation memo accidentally disappeared from the agenda within 24 hours of that remark. And while the phone lines went silent, social media exploded. Hashtags like #TakeBackCanada and #BoycottUSA simultaneously trended in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. Canadians started sharing screenshots of cancelled U.S. flights with captions like, "Instead of Las Vegas, I'll raise goldfish at home. Less flashy, still fun." It seemed like a momentary outburst, but it wasn't. Polls in March 2025 showed that over 60% of Canadians strongly supported freezing travel and economic relations with the U.S., especially among younger generations. Those who grew up viewing America as the shopping paradise and home of Marvel movies now looked at their southern friend with skepticism. Is this still a strategic partner, or just a quarrelsome neighbor? In Washington, the reaction was swift. A senator from Ohio bluntly declared, "Canada is waging economic warfare with unpacked suitcases." Other lawmakers proposed retaliatory tariffs on products from Quebec, including maple syrup, which everyone knows is crossing the final line in North American diplomacy. However, Americans didn't entirely lose their sense of humor. A late-night comedy show aired a sketch titled "Silent Divorce: When Canada Stops Answering America's Texts." In it, the actor playing Canada sat quietly on a sofa, while the U.S. ran around with plane tickets and donuts, shouting, "We still haven't gone to Disneyland together." Laughter aside, concern was real. The U.S. State Department was forced to form a special task force to re-evaluate the structure of bilateral relations. A phrase that sounded both grand and desperate. Because when you have to re-evaluate something once considered stable, it means it no longer is. Still, the most thoughtful insight came from a veteran Canadian diplomat who spoke without cameras, without a microphone. "We're not against America. We're just tired of always being the one to compromise. And now we want to see how far we can stand on our own." That statement wasn't an attack. It was a declaration of dignity. And like all arguments between longtime companions, The deepest hurt doesn't come from action, but from feeling overlooked. Even so, a faint ray of hope breaks through the diplomatic clouds. Both the U.S. and Canada are nations that have overcome the worst with kindness. Though currently locked in a war of words, both still hold on to something precious: the ability to laugh while hearts still ache. Because sometimes a hug can begin right where a punch once landed. And along the world's longest unguarded border, hope can still sneak across before politics manages to close the gate. Shopping now requires a nationality. If Canadians used to ask, "Is the tax included?" when shopping by 2025, the question changed to, "Is this product purely Canadian?" Not because of a sudden burst of patriotism, nor out of endless anger, but because of something very simple. When politics start interfering with travel plans and dreams of Disneyland, consumers respond with their shopping carts. The Buy Canadian wave didn't start with a massive media campaign, but with silence. Silence at the airport, at border shops, and in diplomatic meetings. When people no longer felt welcome the way they used to in the neighboring country, they began looking back at what they still had, and what was in their fridge. And so, a quiet revolution unfolded right in the grocery aisles. From Toronto to Winnipeg, cereal boxes labeled "Made in Ontario" began outselling brands imported from the South. In major supermarkets, signs reading "Local product, support Canadians" were no longer just PR slogans, but became declarations of consumer identity. A shopper in Calgary even started a blog called Borderless Meals, except the U.S., sharing recipes made entirely with anti-USA origin ingredients, complete with regional maple syrup reviews. Retail responded faster than ever. Chains like Loblaws, Canadian Tire, and Metro raced to market their national roots, from toothpaste developed by Quebec dentists to soap made from melted Yukon snow. One toilet paper brand even claimed 100% wood pulp from Canadian forests, soft, clean, and not sourced from any politically unstable U.S. state. Gentle, yet firm in stance. Interestingly, this wave didn't carry the scent of hatred. On the contrary, it had a soft, graceful tone, very Canadian. No shouting, no fanfare, just quiet choices in favor of homegrown. A mother in Halifax shared, "I don't hate Americans, but if my kid can't easily visit New York the way I once did, then at least I want them to grow up with cookies made in Saskatchewan." But it didn't stop at supermarkets. Fashion, tech, and entertainment also felt a clear shift. Domestic fashion brands like Frank and Oak, Roots, or Tentree suddenly sold out as people wanted to wear identity-driven jackets. Tech startups stamped "Made in Canada" received more investment just for not being based in Silicon Valley. And in entertainment, viewership of purely Canadian content spiked, not because of anti-Americanism, but because people wanted to connect with something that didn't require a visa. A concert in Montreal displayed a banner reading "Only Canadian Music Performed" and still sold out. A publishing house in Vancouver, specializing in local authors, hit record sales in March. Even a small cafe in Saskatoon renamed its Americano latte to "Sorry Not Sorry." Same flavor, just a different spirit. Of course, not everyone joined the movement with full passion. Some simply found it more convenient to shop local. Some still secretly ordered from Amazon in Seattle and asked friends to smuggle it over. But that's exactly what made the movement special. It wasn't forced, it spread. No trumpets, just a shift in perspective. On the American side, exporters began to worry. Not because sales dropped overnight, but because Canada had long been the easygoing market, stable, close, and rarely upset. Now, when the calm neighbor quietly folds the menu, walks away from the table, and doesn't come back, the seller starts scrambling to learn French to retain customers. The funny part, in trade hearings in Washington, they no longer debated aluminum or steel tariffs. They debated consumer behavior. How do we win back Canadian hearts? One senator proposed a cultural exchange fair. Another joked, "What if we waive visas for every bottle of maple syrup bought at Walmart?" And while there's no clear answer yet, one thing is certain. This boycott didn't happen through protests or slogans, but through quiet choices in aisles, at checkout counters, and inside refrigerators. When consumption becomes a declaration, every cookie you pick carries a message. And perhaps never before have Canadians seen so clearly that good neighborliness must also be purchased with respect, not just with Black Friday discounts. When growing up together no longer applies. There are things people never write in textbooks, but still become national memories. For Canadians, part of those memories used to be the first time setting foot in the U.S., the first time seeing the endless wide streets of Los Angeles, the first time hearing the heavy New York accent, or simply the first time buying a cheap and good pair of Nike shoes at an outlet across the border. However, in 2025, something silent but serious has occurred. For the first time in many generations, those experiences are being cut off quietly but thoroughly. And it's not just about losing a trip. It's a cultural rupture. When Canada stops flying to the U.S. and people begin turning their backs on goods, brands, and landmarks of their once closest neighbor, a big question grows in the minds of educators, parents, and cultural workers. What image of America will young Canadians grow up with? A sixth-grade geography teacher in Ottawa sighed. "When I was a student, the map of America was the map of dreams. Now, for my students, it's like a Wikipedia page to study for exams, not a place to dream about." In reality, student trips that were once very common, from Montreal to Boston, from Calgary to Seattle, have been cancelled en masse. Activities that seemed very small, like running a marathon in New York, cross-border summer camps in Vermont, or high school robotics competitions between the two countries, all have been postponed indefinitely, simply because there are no more flights, no more insurance, no more policy cooperation. 10-year-olds today may not see any difference, but 10 years from now, those 20-year-olds will enter life without any memories of America. No family road trips across the border, no photos in front of the Statue of Liberty, no stories to share with friends like, "Last winter, I was in Florida." And when memories are gone, affection, over time, also fades. Don't forget, culture isn't just transmitted through books or movies. It lives through direct experiences. If you've never strolled in San Francisco, never eaten a burger at a roadside diner in Texas, never queued for concert tickets in Chicago, then America will just be America. Nothing more, nothing less. Conversely, this also significantly affects how Americans view Canada. Even though the U.S. still has Disneyland, Hollywood, Wall Street, and all the grand things that draw the world's attention, Canada used to be the smart, kind, and calm friend that America needed for balance. But when cities like Vancouver or Halifax no longer have American weekend tourists, when Canadian students no longer attend U.S. universities through exchange programs, when Canadian brands are no longer prominent in the U.S. market, then the name Canada will begin to fade from the everyday memory of Americans. An American journalist writing for The Atlantic warned, "We're not just losing a market. We might be losing a generation of friends." However, the very North American optimism still exists. A Canadian artist opened an exhibition in Toronto titled, "We Miss America, but Not Enough to Endure More." The main piece is a map of North America made from expired visa papers. Meanwhile, a high school in British Columbia renamed its annual field trip from Spring Break in Seattle to This Spring We Go to Saskatoon, and students still enjoyed it. Therefore, this might not be called a breakup, but a quiet farewell. No one is shouting, no one is pounding the table. But each cancelled vacation, each unstamped passport, each piece of clothing not bought from a U.S. outlet, is a brick removed from the once sturdy cross-border bridge. And the question arises, will that bridge be rebuilt? Or will it forever remain a memory only found in faded Polaroid photos? Because when people no longer grow up together, they will gradually grow apart.